Ooh, I guess we know we're starting. Um, Good evening, everybody. It's really nice to have you all here. Welcome to 3GNY Stories Live, We Do Wednesday. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dave Rekas. I have the privilege of serving as the executive director of 3GNY, and I am the grandson of 4 Holocaust survivors. I'm really honored to welcome you to this, which is our 33rd We Do Wednesday program, and the first featuring a live in-person audience here at the beautiful Center for Jewish History, in addition to our loyal virtual audience. So thank you everyone joining on Zoom. We're really glad that you're all here with us for this special We Do Wednesday program, and we look forward to having you join us for additional programs in the future. When this series started in 2020, during the pandemic, community programming like this, along with the support of so many of you, helped spark an incredible period of growth for 3GNY, bringing our family stories and educational and community programs to thousands of students and community members across the country. With May being Jewish American History Month, it's even more fitting that we're all gathered here tonight to celebrate and honor one particularly Jewish American story. Just one example of how 3GNY highlights and celebrates Jewish American heritage throughout the year with our community and students. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit founded by grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and our supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse audiences, diverse communities about the perils of intolerance, and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. We empower 3Gs to share their stories. For tonight's event, we're really proud to feature veteran 3GNY speaker Elliot Zelinger, sharing the story of his grandfather, Sam Zelinger. I've had the privilege of knowing and working with Elliot for the last several years, and I'm deeply moved by his dedication to carrying forward his grandfather's legacy to make a positive impact in our world. More on Elliot in just a moment. Tonight's program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, WEDU, which is short for We Educate. WEDU empowers grandchildren of survivors to compellingly share their family's Holocaust experiences in classrooms and community settings like this one. Studies have shown that students who receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They're more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information, and they are more likely to be upstanders. And when paired with testimony from survivors and their descendants, these impacts are even more profoundly realized. Through our grandparents' stories, we provide a human face to the past and a living link to the future, inspiring our listeners to stand up to anti-Semitism and hatred and to act with courage and compassion. 3GNY, and now as part of a national movement with Living Links, has trained more than 600 speakers in New York, New Jersey, and around the country. We've shared our stories in more than 2,000 classrooms and have impacted more than 100,000 audience members. Just this school year alone, our over 36,000 students and community members will hear our personal family stories from the Holocaust. While our family stories of survival and resilience have reached so many people over the past few years, we know that there is more to do. We're witnessing anti-Semitism at record highs. Holocaust denial and distortion continue to increase, and our communal discourse is rife with vitriol and division. I don't think I need to go further with all of you on that. Against this backdrop, our work has assumed greater urgency. Now, more than ever, we need your help to meet the moment and to ensure that we are countering anti-Semitism and hate with meaningful education that leaves a lasting impact. We also must continue to nurture, sustain, and grow our incredible 3G community. Thousands of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who found a home with 3GNY and 3GNJ, as we're known in New Jersey, and understand the immense responsibility that comes with this family history. We encourage you to make a gift to 3GNY's Chai Fund today. You can do so easily with a link in the chat that will be put up there in a little bit. Those of you here at the Center for Jewish History, there are QR codes in the back of the room. and help us stand up to hate through our love of our grandparents. We promised our grandparents that we'd make sure their memory and stories continue to live on. Your support helps us keep that promise. So thank you for believing in 3GNY's mission. I also want to extend our sincere thanks to our great partners here at the Center for Jewish History for welcoming our community into their space for tonight's program and for their enthusiastic support of our mission. It's now my distinct honor to introduce Allison Reynolds, one of our wonderful 3G speakers and a dedicated board member of our organization, to introduce Elliot and tonight's program.
Thank you, Dave. And hello, everyone, both in person and joining us virtually. My name is Allison Reynolds. I am the granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, and I proudly serve on the board of 3GNY for the past 5 years. It was in 5th grade when we were learning about the Holocaust in school for the first time, but I already knew a few things. I knew I was Jewish, I knew my grandmother was a survivor, and I knew Hitler was evil. So when a boy in my class said he wished Hitler were still alive and that he seemed pretty cool, I was devastated. I realized we were learning about the history of the Holocaust, the dates, some new terms, some cities, but not the stories of the Holocaust with any connection to how it impacted real people and families. I realized I took my grandmother for granted, but that I could share her. So I arranged with my teacher for my grandmother to come visit class and tell her story, so this boy could meet my grandmother. My grandma passed away in her 100th year of life, the same year I joined 3GNY. When I did my own WEDU Wednesday program back in 2021, students from that 5th grade class tuned in, and they texted me that they clearly remember the day they met my grandmother. That is what those 100,000 people reached through 3GNY has done. They've met our grandparents through us. And that is what we will all do today, meet Elliot's grandfather through him. It is my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Elliot Zelinger. A born and raised New Yorker, Elliot is a graduate of Binghamton University, where he earned a degree in psychology and currently works in commercial real estate here in New York City. He lives on Long Island with his wife, on Long Island, I want to be on Long Island, with his wife and 2 sons, and is an avid New York sports fan, so he's a happy camper today. Elliot serves as a board member of 3GNY, Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, where he has spent the past 3 years sharing his grandfather's Holocaust survival story with students across New York City and Long Island. One special note to add, in addition to the story you'll hear about Elliot's grandfather, we learned from Elliot that his grandfather Sam's loved sour pickles. And for those of you here in person, the pickles that we've been enjoying during our reception are a very special tribute in honor of Elliot's grandfather. And they have been generously donated by the Pickle Guys, located at the corner of Grand and Essex right here in New York City. While Elliot is sharing, for those of you on Zoom, please drop your questions into the Q&A. We will have plenty of time for discussion and questions for those at home and in person. So, Elliot, I am very pleased to welcome you. Take it away.
I want to thank Dave and Allison, 3GNY, Center for Jewish History, for having us tonight, for providing such a supportive community and a situation, and to be able to tell this story tonight. I want to thank everybody here in person, family, friends who made it here tonight. I want to thank everybody on Zoom. I know there's people listening in tonight, not only throughout the country, but throughout the world. Thank you. Lastly, I want to thank Steven Spielberg. Steven, is he here? Yeah. I guess he couldn't make it tonight. But I want to thank Steven Spielberg because he produced the USC Shoah Foundation in the 1990s. After Schindler's List was a success, he wanted to take it one step farther. He wanted to provide an opportunity for survivors to share their testimony. And he interviewed several survivors throughout the world. One of them was my grandfather, Sam Zelinger. This is important to me because my grandpa, who I'll refer to as Zadie, he never talked about the war. So this experience allowed him to tell his story. And without those testimonies, I wouldn't be sharing this today. My other source of information and inspiration is this book called The Road to Freedom, written by Regina Zelinger. Regina was Zadie's sister. She survived the war. She wrote memoirs, and 40 years later, her children published it into a book. So while this is her individual story, I learned a lot about my family history through these records. I was fortunate to spend 26 years of my life with Zadie. And when I say Zadie, Zadie is a Yiddish word for grandpa. Bubby is a Yiddish word for grandma. So my Bubby and my Zadie were very influential people in my life. Bubby was a survivor too. Unfortunately, she passed away when I was 9. She never had the opportunity to share her testimony, but she's a huge part of our history and the reason I'm here today. And just introducing a few people, throughout some pictures, you'll see Bubby and Zadie, me, my brothers. I'm one of 4 boys. I have a lot of cousins, um, and Zadie was very influential in our life. One thing I remember about Zadie was he was always in cash businesses. He always had a wad of cash sticking out. And being one of the older cousins, whenever I would see him earlier on, we would get $100 bills. And I was so excited. As more cousins were born, those hundreds became 50s. And by the end, I was lucky if I got $20. But I really have a lot of good memories of Zadie. Going to dinner on Central Avenue in Cedarhurst, family getting together, visiting him in Florida. He had a place in Miami Beach. He had a house upstate in the bungalow colony in the summer. We spent a lot of time there. So it was really just a lot of visits and happiness. And I knew nothing about his experience at the war. He made sure that his grandkids had a happy life, and that was something he never talked about. Sour pickles. Some families maybe vanilla or chocolate, Coke or Pepsi. Um, in my family, it was sour pickles or half sour pickles. And it wasn't really a debate. It was sour pickles. And no garlic sour, no horseradish. It was straight sour pickles. And I remember one time at a family affair, Zadie was so stubborn. Um, I took the last sour pickle in the container. And I kid you not, he didn't talk to me for a week. And if you know Zadie, I was lucky it was only a week. But that was who he was. He was stubborn, but he loved his family. And that's something I'll always remember about him. One of the happiest times of Zadie's life was my bar mitzvah. I remember it vividly. Seeing a grandchild called to the Torah, the next generation continuing the faith, was so important to him. And what I want remember about that was, if you remember back in the day at bar mitzvahs, there was a videographer, and he would go to every table, and everybody would say something, and it was always the same. Congratulations, Elliot, you did great today, and on to the next. But Zadie's was different. He looked in the camera and said, Elliot, I wish you much nachas, which means luck, and you should marry a nice Jewish girl. At 13 years old in November of 1996, I was probably more focused on the Yankees-Braves World Series game at the time. But that's what Zadie meant. He was serious, he meant it, and I followed through on that by marrying Jamie. Coinciding with this happy time was also when I started to learn about the Holocaust. I started to ask questions. Zadie, what is the number on your arm? What does that mean? A9508, can you explain it to me? And he never would talk about it, but that's when I started to ask questions more and learn about the Holocaust, which is what I'm here today to share. So let me talk about Zadie's upbringing. Zadie was born in Romania, 1924, on Christmas Eve, in a small town called Campulung La Tisa. This town was about 3,000 people. It was a mix of Jews and non-Jews. The Jewish population made up about 20% of the town. He was the oldest of 9 children, so with that responsibility, he took care of a lot of the kids. His parents owned a general store in town, so by no means were they wealthy, but they were comfortable, provided a nice living, and he had a great childhood by most accounts. He was a religious young man. He was fortunate that he was able to go to yeshiva on nights and weekends after public school. So that was something he really cherished for the rest of his life. And his grandparents and his cousins, they owned a farm around the town. So I picture this idyllic town on the river, agriculture, there were job opportunities, nobody locked doors, friends got along. It was really a great upbringing. The first sense of adversity he had was in 1938 when his mother passed away. That changed the family dynamic a little bit. As the oldest, he was forced to help out in the store more, help out at home more, took him away from his everyday life, and that created a change, but it was nothing like what was going to happen next. We all know in the 1930s, we know now what was happening in Eastern Europe. The rise of Nazism, Hitler coming to power, Jews being stripped of voting rights, the Nuremberg laws, events like Kristallnacht. It's well documented. We know this now, but he didn't know this at the time. It was a while before this anti-Semitism invaded his hometown. And when I talk to schools, I remind the kids that a lot of time this happened over years. This was 80 years ago. Now it's different. In this age of information and technology, all it takes is one post, one click, hit send, and information can spread so much quicker, so it's powerful. So it's important that we remain vigilant, tell the stories, and that's one of the reasons I'm here today. Eventually, anti-Semitism started to hit this small town of 3,000 people, and his life changed. All of a sudden, he says in his testimony, my friends were just neighbors. Eventually, they were enemies. He talks about being kicked out of school. I think the toughest change for him was when the community started to boycott his family business. His father had no way of making a living, so Zaidi, being the oldest, took it upon himself, and he started trading in the black market. So he was traveling back and forth, selling goods. Maybe they were stolen, maybe they weren't. He did what he had to do to survive. But I think this was his first taste of entrepreneurialism. This is where he learned how to trade. He learned how to become a businessman. And things were tough for several years. And then ultimately, in 1944, is when they got a knock on the door. It said, be at the schoolyard at 7 p.m. So at this point, his family, all 9 kids, his stepmom, his father had remarried, and his father took a bag and were going to the schoolyard. On that walk over, his father was kidnapped and arrested. Imagine the fear he must have felt. He didn't know when he was going to see his father again. He didn't know if he was going to see his father again. So all 9 children were rounded up, were taken to a ghetto, and they lived in Slatina ghetto together. There were about 17 people in 2 bedrooms in a lot of fear, but they made it work. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't what they were used to, but the conditions were tolerable in a sense. But really, it was the fear. It was what was happening next. And then ultimately, they were led to what was called the final destination, and that was Auschwitz. They arrived in Auschwitz in June of 1944. And picture this scene of a family of 9, among other families. There were thousands of people torn apart from families. It's the middle of summer. The guards are barking orders, pulled in different directions. Mothers were separated from their children. Twins were split apart. It was a scene of mayhem. He didn't know it at the time, but this is the last time he would ever see his 4 youngest siblings. I've read that about 80% of Jews who arrived in Auschwitz were exterminated in the first 2 hours. There was about 1.1 million people, so you could do the math. Zaidi, maybe because he was 20 years old or so at the time, survived. Now we know this process is called selection. The people who survived were forced to work in the camp. There were forced labor camps, and Zaidi worked in a coal mine. For 12 hours a day, he was shackled up to 5 people in shacks like a slave, working in a coal mine 400 meters below ground, day in, day out. Lost all sense of time. He wasn't recognizable. By his estimation, in the concentration camps, he weighed maybe 75 pounds. He didn't know what day was next. And I think for him, the hardest part was emotionally and mentally, not knowing when this torture was going to end. At least back at home, he had a rough day. He knew Shabbat was coming every Friday, and he could adjust, recalibrate. He didn't have that opportunity. So the psychological warfare, the tormenting, the barracks were filled with disease, overcrowding, witnessing death was a regular occurrence. These were the conditions of Auschwitz. At least these are my interpretation of it. Let's hear it from him.
And over there was Dr. Mengele, which I could still remember his face. He was standing there with a stick and his bifocals and said, left, links, rechts. That means left, right. And we were like, first they killed us with our minds, not physically so far, that's mentally. They made you feel like you're nothing, like you're just a living thing.
How did they do that?
Just by plain oppressing us. Just by plain not giving us the food and not letting us be who we are. Mm-hmm. They took our name away, they took our souls away, and they took our thinking away. We did not think anymore. And that was in the beginning. Later on, we didn't even know what day it was.
Were you frightened?
We didn't even feel nothing. We had no feelings. We didn't feel frightened. We didn't feel nothing. We just worried about pushing the day across and worry about the next day.
When you arrived at Auschwitz, did you know what Auschwitz was?
No, never heard of it. Never heard of Auschwitz. Never knew anything about it. We got in there, and that's all I knew. The next day,
This is an image of what prisoners look like in the concentration camps. I can only imagine Zayd didn't look much different. He talked about not having food. They were given one piece of bread and jelly a day to survive. He told the story in his testimony, which gives me the chills. Every once in a while, they were given a bowl of hot soup to eat. And you'd think if you'd look like this, you would want soup, you'd be fighting over the soup. Yet nobody touched it. The reason is every time they were given soup, 2 or 3 people from his barrack would disappear. They genuinely believed that somebody standing on either side of them one day was killed and cooked and was fed to them as a meal the next day. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that was the psychological warfare. That was how they thought, and this is what went on in the camps. When I think about it, we talked about the physical effects, the mental effects. How do you survive? Literally, how do you keep going? And something had to happen. And then one day, something pretty incredible happened. He was going to work in the coal mine, walking down, and there were 2 shifts of 12 hours I mentioned. And he gets to the bottom, and the bottom shift is coming up. They overlap, and he hears a voice, and it's an older man. It's pitch black. It's filled with smoke. I mean, it's a coal mine, and he can't see anything. Everyone's delirious, and he hears a voice, and this man is talking about his life in his hometown, his family, what had been. And he gets closer and closer, and he says, I know that I recognize that voice. That's a familiar voice. And he's trying to put 2 and 2 together. Can anyone guess who that voice was?
But at the same time as I was going down in the mine one day, I hear an old man telling a story about his family, his children. I take a look. Who is it? My own father, which I thought already he was gone. And we were together for quite a while after this in the mine. Matter of fact, a few days later, he had saved my life because
Pretty remarkable. A chance meeting with his father, who he didn't even know was still alive. I personally think that's what gave him the strength, the courage to keep going. There's an unconditional love between a child and parents that can't be replicated, and that gave him enough strength. And when he references, my father saved my life, what he's referring to is there was another selection right after. And he heard on the loudspeaker one day, A9508. Remember, he wasn't Sam Zelinger anymore. He was A9508. Was called to the office with Dr. Joseph Mengele, who he talked about. And the head of his division was a Jewish man who oversaw the unit, who knew his father. So this man went with his 82 selection, vouched for him, and stood up and said, you cannot take Sam Zelinger. I need him. He's one of my best workers. You'd be making a big mistake. And Zaidi and his supervisor took such a beating, but they survived. They walked out alive. He talks about being with his father and the rest of the camps and the coal mine. Fortunately, they spent time in Auschwitz together, and then from there, they were transported to the next camp, which is Buchenwald. As bad as Auschwitz was, in Zaidi's testimony, he says Buchenwald was even worse. How could it be worse than what I just described? The reason is there was lice rampant throughout the camp. So 24 hours of untreated lice made the conditions so uncomfortable that even though he was only there for a few months, it was awful. He hated it. This is where he said goodbye to his father. His father was an older man. He passed away from natural causes. He was sick. But in a way, I think there was something peaceful about it. And there were 2 other times in the camps where his father saved his life. I know that because he talks about him specifically in his testimony. After Buchenwald, he was transferred to another camp, to Reichenstadt. It was a march. Now we know this is called the Death March. Most people didn't survive. It was the middle of the winter. At this point, between the conditions, physically they weren't able to make it. Some of the prisoners were executed on the way just for being Jewish or for being too slow or holding the line up. And it was these conditions, he was lucky to have survived. But something I learned from watching this testimony is that Zaidi always had knee trouble. He didn't talk about why. My dad and his siblings would mention, Zaidi had bad knees, he had arthritis, and no one really knew why until we saw this video.
I said, I had enough. Go ahead, shoot me, to a young German. And he said, he took off his bayonet from his rifle, and he pushed it through my knee, which I still have the mark till this day. In one and out on the other. And He said, "Du musst dich noch plagen." That means you still have to suffer. You're not ready to die. So I ripped the sleeve off my shirt. I tied my knee up. We weren't far away from Theresienstadt already.
So in case you could understand, what he said was the officer took his knife, stabbed it through Zadie's leg from the back to the front, and said, "I'm not going to kill you. You haven't suffered enough." So what did Zadie do? Took his shirt off, wrapped it around his leg, bandaged himself up, and kept on going till they arrived in Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was a concentration camp. It was one of the last ones to be liberated. This camp was interesting because it was almost like the model camp, the show camp, to show the rest of the world, Red Cross, that it's not so bad. Camps aren't so bad. So they faked this environment where they offered games and theater and movies, and they actually had a fake currency that they would use to give survivors to show the world that conditions weren't so bad. But we knew otherwise. At this point, Zadie had mentioned that he was maybe 75 pounds. So the conditions were just as bad. Ultimately, in June of 1945, the Allied forces came in and liberated the concentration camps. Whether it's true or not, Zadie had said in his testimony that the next day, the Nazis were planning on blowing up the camp altogether, all 30,000 people in Theresienstadt. So another way, he was lucky to be alive. And when he looked back on his survival story, in the interviewer asked him a question. She introduces him at one point and says, "I'm here with Sam Zelinger, Holocaust survivor." He interrupted her and said, "No, I'm a 10-time survivor." Between surviving selection, the 3 camps, the death march, I can go on and on about how lucky he is to be alive. But he survived. Most of his family wasn't as lucky. So what do you do after the camp? He's 21 years old. He doesn't know where to go. He did probably what I would have done. He went back to his hometown. You want to see, what's left of it, who's still alive, pick up the pieces. And unfortunately for him, it wasn't any better than it was when he left. Their homes were inhabited. There was no work opportunities. The town was decimated. There was no future for him. He did what he knew to survive by working in the black market once again. But what's memorable about going back home is where he met his wife, Bubby. She had survived the Holocaust. She had lost her whole family. Her uncle had set them up. They got together, and they started their life together. So they didn't know each other before the war, but they reconnected in their hometown after the war. Shortly after they got together, and what do you do next? How do you rebuild your life? So a lot of the refugees at this point went to DP camps, displaced persons camps. And these were opportunities for people to start their lives over. I mean, if you think about it, a generation of people they were kicked out of schools. They weren't able to work. They were in the war. They were mentally frozen. They didn't acquire life skills. So the DP camps are where the Jews gathered. And ironically, a lot of time, these DP camps were at the sites of concentration camps. So if that wasn't a mental screwing with them, and I don't know what is. But what's memorable is that my father, who's here tonight, was born in a DP camp in Germany, January 1st, 1949. When he was 6 months old, they came to America. Bubby and Zadie had an uncle who sponsored them to come to America. And what's so funny about that story is it was July 4th weekend. And picture the scene of 2 new parents coming to America for a better life. And you had this mother who was holding on to her son for dear life. There was nothing more important than nurturing that kid, than holding him, than protecting him. She had him bundled up in blankets and jackets and coats. It was 107 degrees out. So supposedly there's a picture of this image in the front page of the paper, which I'd love to see. So July 4th weekend, as we know in America, for fireworks and independence, also carries other meaning for my family too. When Zadie started out, like many Jews in this time, he settled in the Lower East Side. And looking for work, he worked in a factory. He got a job working in a factory in the garment center, and he assembled uniforms for soldiers. And the 3rd day on the job, they gave him an iron, and they told him to iron a uniform. And he burnt that uniform to a crisp. He was fired a few days later. His boss said to him, "I'm going to pay you for the week. Your pay is $37, but I'm only going to give you 34." And Zadie looked at him and said, "I don't want a penny." He goes, "I worked hard for that. If I made a mistake, I'm here to learn. I'm working. Nobody is going to take anything from me ever again." He had that mentality that he would not be cheated, he would not be screwed, and he didn't take the check. He didn't have a backup plan, but he was so firm in his belief that nobody was going to tell him what to do. And from that day forward, he never talked about it, but he never worked for anybody else again. He had his own businesses. So from there, he went back to Lower East Side and had a push cart, and he was selling bananas and eggs. And he talks about it. He couldn't even say bananas, his accent. He was saying panana, panana. And he was making $6 or $7 a day, scraping to get by. And he worked and he hustled. And he turned that into an opportunity to own a supermarket. 2.5 years later, he was off to the races. He owned 5 supermarkets. From the Lower East Side, they went to Staten Island for a couple of years. At this point, it was still only my father. In Staten Island, one of Zadie's proudest achievements is that he started the first yeshiva in Staten Island with a group of people. I believe that still exists today and under a different form. Shortly after they moved to Queens, where they spent most of their life, at this point, Uncle Philip, Aunt Shari, Aunt Marilyn joined the party. They were a family of 4. Zadie had supermarkets. My father and his siblings had a great childhood, very memorable. This was in Queens. At the time, he also started to, he got a place in Florida. He had a place in Israel. He was upstate New York. And these are when my memories start to come into play of Zadie, in the later years. But a lot of his formative years were in Queens. 179-30 Hillside Avenue. Right now, I wouldn't recognize this. It's a luxury residential tower. I remember this building as an OTB when I was younger, maybe a general store. But before that, that was the site of Zadie's last supermarket. He was a tenant. He was down on his luck. His career was full of a lot of ups and downs. This was towards a down point in his career. And the woman who owned the building was a German woman. She was an older lady. And she didn't have any siblings to give the building to. And she said to Zadie, please buy this building from me. I want to give it to you. Whether she felt guilty about the events of the Holocaust or not, we don't know. That didn't matter. She said, I just need $25,000, buy this building. So he went home to Bubby and said, the landlord wants to sell the building to me, but I don't have any money. She said, what do you mean you don't have any money? He said, I don't have any money. I just have this cash on me. She said, hold on. She went upstairs, came back with a shoebox full of $25,000. But that was true of that generation. Most people who survived the Holocaust, similar to the Great Depression, they saved for a rainy day, they conserved. Not Zadie. He always wanted to show what he had. He was proud of it. But Bubby, every day we'd come home from work, would take a few dollars from his bankroll, store it, and that enabled him to buy the building. What's even more powerful about the building, to me, is that this was the first sense of stability in his life. So much had been taken from him. So much of it was gains, it was losses. But one way or another, come the first of the month, he was collecting rent from tenants. And I have memories of going with my father to pick up the rent every month, and that was very special. What I hadn't shared in this process is Zadie went through a ton of loss also. I mentioned that my Bubby died at 61 years old. Regina, the author of this book, survived the Holocaust, only to be killed in a car crash in Israel in her 40s. Zadie's youngest daughter, my Aunt Shari, was sick in her 30s and passed away at a very young age. So despite all the gains in his life, the losses followed him throughout. This is a letter from a doctor, December 1996, and I want to read the last paragraph. I feel that his depression, anxiety, heart, and his arthritic conditions are directly related to his incarceration. These events produced irreversible scars, and his symptoms have worsened. I feel that Mr. Zelinger is 85% disabled. That was 50 years after the war. We know the mental pain never went away, but neither did the physical pain. In this picture, you see Zadie with his second wife, Fanny, who reminds me a lot of Bubby in a lot of ways. She was also a Holocaust survivor. And why this image is so important is because she also gave her testimony in the Spielberg documentary. She did it first. He didn't want to tell his story, but she pushed him and motivated him to tell all. So because of her, I'm here to tell his story today. And that was the only time he ever told his story. This was in 1996. It wasn't like he opened up and shared. It was a one-shot deal, and I think he knew in a way that his story would be continued. So I have a lot of gratitude for Fanny and for helping him to get to that point. A lot of who I am today is because of Zadie. In addition to the physical resemblance you see in this picture, we both have a strong identity for family, a strong work ethic. I work in sales directly from him. So a lot of who I am today is because of his influence on me. And to honor Zadie, almost 100 years later in the Jewish faith, it's common to name a child after someone who's no longer with us. So when I had my firstborn, Seth, it was a no-brainer that we were going to name him with the letter S. So Seth is named after Sam. And when you think about Zadie's legacy, he had 4 children, 12 grandchildren, over 30 great-grandchildren. What better way is there to say we won? And now, a generation later, our family's not so different. My father is Zadie to his grandkids. He has 10 grandchildren. So the legacy carries on. Living through Zadie's history was the hard part. Telling his story is the easy part. This is my family today, Jamie, Seth, Jake, and I'm going to make sure that Zadie's legacy lives on. What he had said at the end of his testimony when he was asked, why do you tell your story? What do you want the world to know? He had said, I want the world to know what happened. Nobody wins when it comes to anti-Semitism and hate. And 30 years later, that's my message. As a friend said to me years ago, we all bleed red. And that is the takeaway from today's conversation. Thank you.
We're going to transition for a brief moment so that we can take some questions and continue the conversation with Elliot.
While you're settling, just Elliot, thank you for gifting us with that story, your family's story. That was my first time hearing it, and so moving and so personal. And thank you for just sharing that with us. We're going to open it up to questions. As a reminder, if you have a question for Elliot, for those of you on Zoom, wherever you are, please put them in the Q&A function feature on the Zoom chat, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible.
And Elliot, thank you for sharing so beautifully. I want to start us off with a question because you and I have talked quite a bit about the fact that your Zadie didn't talk to you directly about his story. And as you have taken on this responsibility to share his story with others, I wonder if you have considered what he would think of you doing this work and sharing his story today. And if you could share what that thought process or feeling is like for you.
I think he wouldn't have admitted he was happy, but he would have been proud of me. I think the reason he opened up and did his testimony was for a day like today, so that his story would be told. He wouldn't ask for it, but I know that's what he would have wanted.
If anyone here has questions, feel free to raise your hands. And I see a couple coming in on the Zoom Q&A as well. Yeah, and Allison will bring the microphone to you so that you can be heard directly into the microphone.
So what I found fascinating with a lot of Holocaust survivors is that they don't carry that much anger, at least in my personal experience with my grandfather. Like, I feel like I see all of these like villain characters in today's day and age, and I'm like so angry. And then whenever I spoke to my grandfather, he was always like, I feel like it's survival almost. Is that something that you experienced with your grandfather? Like, did he have anger, like oppressed openly?
I think he had a lot of anger, but he hid it. You know, his way of showing it was not showing it. So he kept to himself. He was very distrusting. He didn't have a lot of friends. It was really just about family. So I think he definitely carried that anger, but
Not
didn't
outwardly.
open up about it.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a follow-up from Zoom is about whether Zadie or you have traveled back to Romania to visit his hometown and to trace the places that he traveled through during his life.
Yep, Zadie did do it. He talks about in his testimony. He went back, I think it was in the 80s, and that picture I showed from his hometown was a picture he took that he believes was his house growing up. So he did go back, and it's something that I plan to do. I haven't had the opportunity yet, but I definitely will. And my parents have also. They've been back to Eastern Europe and a lot of the sites of where these events occurred.
First off, thank you very much for sharing your story. It was really moving, and appreciate that. Quick question about with Zaidi. He was moved a couple of times to other concentration camps. Was there any official explanation or reasoning behind that? Was that ever, explained?
I don't think there was in his case specifically, but from what we know about the Holocaust is when different camps had a need for workers, they were transferred, or if the Nazis felt that the Allied forces were closing in on the camps, people were transferred. So I assume that his reason would be in line with that.
Another Zoom question on a very different topic of conversation. Which bungalow colony did you stay at over the summers?
It was near Camp Kindering. That was all I remember. Couldn't tell you. Mom, Dad, do you remember? I don't remember which one.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question just because this is an audience of largely adults. We don't know who's online, but you've been an active speaker in school. So I think it would just be interesting to the audience to hear how the students respond to your stories, questions that might stand out to you, people who come up to you, comments that stuck with you, and what that kind of looks like and feels like in a different environment than we're in today.
Yeah, I love when students ask questions because it's honest. They don't hold back, even if they may not be appropriate. Nothing is inappropriate on this topic. So just seeing their natural curiosity, and I think hearing it from someone my age is more relatable to them. There aren't a lot of Holocaust survivors left. A lot of these students don't have access to the survivors. So I think hearing my story makes it a little more tangible for them.
First of all, that was incredible. You touched on this, but when he went back to his hometown, I realized there was no opportunity, but was there still anti-Semitism?
There was. That goes with their homes were inhabited and they felt like outsiders in their hometown. It's just a matter of time before they had to escape again.
Amazing job. Really beautiful to hear. Do you know how your Zadie found out about the fate of all of his siblings? Like, was it one by one, or did he learn about all of it once going home? How did he learn?
I think he learned just because he never saw them again. They knew what was happening at the crematoriums and they saw people disappear. So I think after a certain amount of time, he knew that the inevitable occurred.
People used to put cards on the train stations to say they were alive. That's how people communicated through the card system. So if you were alive, you put your name on the card, and that way your relatives could know you were alive.
Jews are smart. That's like, I mean, that's so crafty to.
So Fred, now that you've joined the conversation, which is wonderful, there's actually a question on Zoom for you. If you're comfortable sharing, to talk a little bit about what it's like for the two of you to hear your father's story, to hear it from your son, and what that means for you and your sense of family and memory and history.
And this question is from your brother.
It validates the continuity of the family. It means that we continue to exist. And that's very meaningful.
I want to reiterate that in case it didn't come through on Zoom, that it validates the continuity of your family, that you continue to exist. That is an incredibly powerful statement. Thank you. Elliot, what motivates you to continue sharing your Zadie's story? You shared a little bit about with us tonight, but you've been very active as a volunteer speaker in our WEDU program. When there are opportunities that come up, what is it that keeps getting you to raise your hand and to take time out of your day to go into a school and share the story with a group of strangers?
I think it's the privilege to be able to. Me and my brothers are the last generation, and my cousin who knew Zadie, who can tell the story. My kids will never know any survivors. So I feel the privilege to carry that on and to bridge the gap.
That's great. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for sharing. That was incredible. I have a feeling that a lot of the survivors who were interviewed by Steven Spielberg, that was the first, for my mother, give me, that was the first time they actually were able to speak of their experience. Do you think he had any idea that after that they would begin speaking to school groups and things would open up the way they did?
I don't think so. I think he was doing it just to get it off his chest. I think it was probably years and years in the making that it was probably a conversation that he wanted to have, an interview he wanted to do for years, but wasn't able to. So I think he just, once his wife did, just saw this as an opportunity to open up for his own sake, less about future generations.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think I've heard a lot of stories where grandchildren have only heard the story through a Shoah tape. So thank Baruch Hashem, like thank gosh that happened. Also, the way that a survivor tells the story to a stranger is very different than how they might tell someone that they love and deeply want to protect. And so you probably have even more graphic in some ways and deep detail than he might have necessarily told, or I mean, he clearly didn't tell to others. And so it's a different experience too, and a different telling. So we're just thankful to the Shoah Foundation. And
Elliot and I were joking in preparation for this when, in talking about how it's thanks to Steven Spielberg that Elliot knows this story, and thanks to that initiative that is now the Shoah Foundation that houses over 55,000 testimonies of Holocaust survivors and other witnesses of the Holocaust and other genocides. And my grandmother talked about her interview all the time as the Spielberg tapes. We have our Spielberg tapes, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that it wasn't just her and Steven sitting on a couch and chatting. Because that's the way it was talked about with us. And so we do have time for just a couple more questions. One, Elliot, I wanted to ask you, you have shared with me, I know that working in business, working in real estate, you bring a lot of your personality, a lot of your family, a lot of the values that you described tonight into the way that you do business. And you've shared with me a little bit about how Zadie's example and his influence have inspired you and taught you as a businessman. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the business acumen that you saw in him and how that has prepared you for your successful ventures.
Yeah, great question. I think it starts with, I learned from him just to take risks, to take calculated risks, but to go for it. He wasn't scared of an opportunity. And, I think first and foremost, I get that from him. And just persistence. I think just, staying on course, taking chances, and keep on going, keep fighting. And, that's all right from him.
a new person in the back.
Hi, I'm Yarden. I moved here from Israel a year and a half ago. And in Israel, the third generation is still something that we're trying to build it up. So first of all, I want to tell you that as a third generation, it was a pleasure to hear you speaking and sharing the story. Like, I was fascinated. And my question is more for like the third generation, how it was for you to start building this story, like from your side, how it was in the beginning, and how you suggest like third generation to just start it, because the start is the most scary part, to take the responsibility, to speak, if we will miss something, if we will say it in a different way. So all of that, this question is something that I would like to know.
We're so glad you asked.
We swear we did not plant Yarden's question. So one of the things that 3GNY has done for years is helping 3Gs learn how to share their stories. Taking the information that we've gotten either directly from our grandparents or from a Shoah Foundation testimony, from family members, from written documents, and piece together a narrative that makes sense for us and helps us make sense of their experiences, and is presented in a way that will make sense to students, to an audience of middle school or high school students who maybe have never had a chance to meet a survivor directly, or who are just learning about the Holocaust for the first time. And so I'm going to ask you in a minute to share what that experience was like for you. But for you, Yarden, and anyone else out there who is interested, now through our national training partner, Living Links, any 3G can sign up for our speaker training program. And there's a very structured and cohort-based way of guiding 3Gs through uncovering the information that you have, piecing it together in a way that follows an arc and a narrative similar to what you saw Elliot do, and prepare you to be able to share that with students and community groups. And really in doing that, to reclaim that story as your own. Because as you saw Elliot do so well, he did not tell Zadie's story the way that Zadie told it on the Shoah Foundation testimonies. Elliot told his version of Zadie's story. And that is a really important piece, is that we as the third generation are just as important characters in this telling, because we are the living link. We are that ongoing legacy of what the Holocaust did to us and what it has taught us about our role and our responsibilities in the world today. And so I want to ask you just to share a little bit about, if you can think back to when you took the class, what was that experience like to start in the beginning with the tapes in front of you, not really knowing where you were going, and how you were able to start piecing together this narrative to share?
Sure. I remember very, very well. I took the course about 3 years ago. And Dave, you were a huge part of it. And even your guidance this past week or two with me just to go through my presentation and fine tune it. So I owe a ton of credit to Dave, our executive director. But the course was interesting. It was a training we did, and it really forced me to hone in on certain points of Zadie's life and my life. And as you said, it's not just repeating his story word for word. It really made me think back to events of my childhood, to my adolescence, and core memories of him. And I think that's what makes it relatable, is when you can put your own spin on it and it's your story. So my training, it was over 3 or 4 weeks, and I learned a lot. And condensing it to 15 or 20 minutes is harder than I think. But it was a great program, and any 3Gs, I would encourage you to take that step and give it a shot.
Elliot will be around, but we're going to wrap up for the evening. Thank you again, Elliot, just so much for speaking tonight, sharing your story. We're so grateful to have you involved in 3GNY. Selfishly, personally, so grateful to have you as part of our board. And thank you to the Center for Jewish History for making this hybrid event possible tonight. Thank you all for joining us. We're glad you took the time to hear Elliot speak words that must never be forgotten. If you haven't yet made a donation to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat and flyers around the room for ways you can donate. Thank you in advance. We would also love your feedback on tonight's program. Please check your email for a quick survey just to help us learn and continue to better serve our 3G community. I'm almost done, I swear. It's like the announcement part of Rosh Hashanah when you're just tired and like you want to go home. Sorry. If you have connections with educators who may want speakers to present in their classes, like Elliot so beautifully did, please let us know. We have a large speakers bureau of hundreds of grandchildren prepared and ready to present.
Just to add to that, we're talking about middle school and high school.
Generally middle school and high school. We also have done universities as well. So yes. We will send an email in the coming days with more information, as well as a recording of tonight's program. You can check out our past WEDU Wednesday recordings on 3GNY's YouTube channel. We hope we see you at more upcoming community programs, including our second annual Evening Under the Stars on August 4th, a really beautiful gala and just celebration of this vibrant community together. Keep an eye on your email for more information about that special evening and other opportunities to connect with our community. Thank you again for taking this time this evening to be with us. We are grateful, as always, for your presence and your support. Thank you.